I had only been living in the new apartment for a week when I first noticed something strange about the lot behind the building. The place wasn't anything special, just another mid-sized complex tucked away on a side street of an already obscure neighborhood. I moved here because the rent was reasonable, and it wasn't far from where I worked. The landlord, an older man with a gruff but businesslike demeanor, handed me the keys with minimal conversation and simply warned me to keep my distance from the lot at the back. "It's private property," he'd muttered, glancing over his shoulder at the bare patch of land just visible through the back window. "Just don't go back there." I hadn't thought much of it at the time. The empty lot didn't seem unusual. Every neighborhood has its odd nooks and crannies. But something about the way he'd said it lingered, like a sliver of ice nestled between my ribs. There was a subtle emphasis in his voice, as if he wasn't merely enforcing a rule but trying to impress upon me a warning. I'd unpacked my things and settled into the new place without a second thought. I didn't even have much time to think about that lot until a few days later when I woke up at 3 in the morning. I had been drifting in and out of sleep when a sound pulled me from my dozing. It was faint, a dull, repetitive thud. For a moment, I thought it was just someone unloading a truck or a piece of construction equipment moving around outside. But as the noise continued, I realized it wasn't coming from the street at all. It was closer, almost right under my window. My heart began to beat faster as I slid out of bed and crept towards the window. I peered through the thin blinds, squinting into the darkness. The complex's backyard was completely still, bathed in the dim glow of a streetlight. But beyond the low chain-link fence that marked the boundary of the lot, I saw something, or rather, someone. A figure, half shrouded in shadow, stood in the middle of the empty lot. It was too dark to see much detail, but I could make out the outline of a tall man, his head tilted slightly upwards as if he were listening for something. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. That in itself wouldn't have been so strange if not for what he was holding. In one hand, the man gripped a long metal rod, tapping it rhythmically against the ground. The dull thunk echoed softly in the night air, almost hypnotic in its steadiness. I couldn't take my eyes off him. He would tap the rod 3 times, pause, then raise his head a little higher, as if waiting for a response. I waited, heart hammering in my chest, but nothing happened. No other sounds followed, no figures moved to meet him. After what felt like an eternity, the man lowered the rod, turned, and vanished into the darkness at the far end of the lot. I stayed at the window long after he disappeared, expecting him to come back to do something else, but the lot remained empty and silent. The next morning, I tried to shrug it off. Maybe it was just a neighbor playing a prank, or some drunk stumbling home late at night. Still, when I glanced out the window again, I couldn't help but notice how eerily still the lot looked in the daylight. There was no sign of the man from the night before. No footprints, no disturbances in the neatly trimmed grass. Nothing to suggest anyone had been there at all. But then I noticed something else. At the very center of the lot, where I'd seen the man standing, a small circular patch of dirt had been cleared away. It was barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, but it was there. A clean, precise ring of bare earth no more than a few feet wide. I tried not to think about it. I reminded myself of what the landlord had said about the lot being private property and decided it was best to leave it alone. But the following night, I heard the tapping again. This time, I stayed in bed, straining my ears against the dark. The sound was softer tonight, like the man was further away, but it was the same steady rhythm. 3 taps, a pause, then 3 more. I fought the urge to look out the window, pulling the covers tighter around myself. Something about that sound made my skin crawl, and every instinct I had screamed at me to ignore it. But after nearly an hour of listening to that rhythmic tapping, curiosity got the better of me. I crept to the window and peeked out. The man was back. He stood in the same spot, holding the same metal rod, tapping the ground in that maddeningly slow rhythm. But this time he wasn't alone. Another figure stood at the edge of the lot, shrouded in shadow. It was smaller, hunched, and unlike the first man, it moved, swaying back and forth slightly, as if shifting its weight from one foot to the other. I couldn't make out its face, but I could tell it was watching the first man, just as I was. My mouth went dry. For a moment, I considered opening the window, shouting down at them, asking what the hell they were doing. But something held me back. Something cold and tight in my chest that warned me not to draw attention to myself. The man stopped tapping. He turned to face the second figure, and though I couldn't see his face, I felt the air around me grow heavier. Then, slowly, deliberately, he raised the rod and pointed it at the ground in front of the other figure. It didn't move. It just stood there, swaying slightly, until the man dropped the rod and turned away, walking back into the darkness just as he had the night before. The second figure lingered for a moment longer, its form blending into the shadows, and then it too was gone. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them standing in the lot, staring at each other in the dark. When I woke up the next morning, I hesitated before looking out the window. But when I finally did, I wasn't surprised to see that the circular patch of dirt had grown. It was subtle, just a few inches wider, but it was there, a perfect ring of bare earth expanding ever so slowly. That's when I realized something. It wasn't just a mark. It was a boundary. And whatever they were doing out there, they were making sure something stayed inside it. I spent the next few days trying to ignore it. I went to work, came home, and made a point to keep my blinds shut after sundown. But every night I would hear the tapping. It didn't matter if I put on music, turned up the TV, or stuffed a pillow over my ears. The sound seeped through, like it was coming from somewhere inside me. That low, steady thunk, thunk, thunk filled my head until I was gritting my teeth, praying for it to stop. By the fifth night, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I waited until the tapping faded into silence, then grabbed a flashlight and crept down the stairs to the backyard. The cool night air hit me like a slap, but I forced myself forward. My hands were trembling, and I felt a sick lurch in my gut, like I was doing something terribly wrong. But I couldn't let it go. I had to see. The lot loomed ahead, a dark void beyond the weak glow of the streetlights. The patch of dirt was clearly visible now, a bare, widening ring that seemed to pulse faintly in the moonlight. I crept closer, heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the chain-link fence, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Symbols. They were small, etched into the bare earth around the edge of the circle. Intricate patterns of lines and curves, looping and intersecting in strange, dizzying formations. I crouched down, peering through the fence, trying to make sense of them. They looked almost mathematical, like some kind of geometric equation that had been warped and twisted into a language I couldn't understand. What the hell was this? My fingers tightened around the cold metal of the fence. I didn't know much about the lot, but one thing was becoming disturbingly clear. This wasn't just an empty patch of land. There was something wrong here, something that went beyond a simple boundary marker. I stood up, flashlight beam skittering over the grass. For a moment, I hesitated, debating whether to go back inside and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But then I spotted it. A small, dark shape lying just inside the circle. A book. It was thin and battered, its cover worn almost completely smooth. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone watching me from the shadows, but the lot was empty. Slowly, I reached through the gap in the fence and hooked a finger under the edge of the book. I tugged it towards me, careful not to disturb the dirt around it. The book slid free, and I pulled it through the fence with a soft rustle. It was heavier than it looked, the leather cover creased and scarred with age. I turned it over, half expecting to see some kind of symbol or title, but there was nothing, just a blank, time-worn surface. Swallowing hard, I flipped it open. The pages were covered in cramped handwriting, each line packed with dense paragraphs of text. The ink had faded in places, but I could still make out most of the words. It looked like a journal of some kind, diary entries maybe, or notes. The handwriting was neat, precise, but there was a frantic edge to it, like the writer had been struggling to get the words down fast enough. May 14th, one entry began. Asterisk, he said it's not safe anymore. The boundary isn't holding. Something is changing in the lot. I can feel it watching me. Asterisk. I flipped through the pages, skimming over entry after entry. Most of it was a jumbled mess. Half-finished sentences, frantic scrawls of nonsense that grew more chaotic the further I went. But one thing kept appearing over and over again, scratched into the margins, underlined in dark, angry strokes. Do not let the boundary break. My mouth went dry. I glanced back at the widening circle of dirt, the symbols etched into its surface. If the writer of this journal was to be believed, then that lot wasn't just private property, it was a containment. And whatever was inside it, it was trying to get out. I should have stopped there. I should have put the journal back, gone inside and called the police or something. But some reckless part of me, the same part that had brought me down here in the first place, refused to let it go. I needed to know more. Taking a deep breath, I turned to the last entry in the journal. The writing was barely legible now, shaky and uneven, as if the author's hand had been trembling too violently to hold the pen steady. Asterisk, June 2nd. I can't do it anymore. The tapping won't stop. Every night it gets louder, closer. I see them out there, standing in the circle, staring at me. The boundary's almost gone. I tried reinforcing the symbols, but it's too late. They're breaking through. I can feel them pulling at the edges, tearing at the seams. God, why won't it stop? Asterisk. The writing cut off abruptly, the last line trailing into a jagged slash that tore through the page. I stared at it, a cold knot of fear tightening in my stomach. The tapping. They were using the tapping to break the boundary. My head spun. I dropped the journal, chest tightening as panic threatened to swallow me whole. The lot stretched out before me, silent and empty, but I could almost feel it pulsing, something dark and malevolent shifting just beneath the surface. The boundary was breaking. Every night it grew a little weaker, a little thinner, until whatever was trapped inside would finally be free. I stumbled back from the fence, heart racing. I needed to tell someone. The landlord, the police, asterisk anyone star. But as I turned to go, something caught my eye. Movement. At the far end of the lot, a shadow shifted. I froze, flashlight beam trembling as I tried to focus on the shape. It was small, hunched over, half hidden in the darkness. And it was tapping. The sound was soft, barely more than a whisper, but I heard it all the same. Thunk, thunk, thunk. I watched, breath hitching. As the figure moved closer, the tapping growing louder, sharper. It reached the edge of the circle, hunched form swaying slightly as it stared down at the dirt. Then slowly it looked up. The flashlight flickered. My breath caught in my throat as I saw its face. Pale, hollow, eyes like empty pits. It grinned, lips peeling back to reveal a mouth full of jagged, uneven teeth. And then it lifted a hand and pointed, straight at me. The flashlight went out. Darkness swallowed me whole. I turned and ran, sprinting across the yard, lungs burning as I tore up the steps and threw myself inside the apartment. I slammed the door behind me, heart hammering, and sank to the floor. Silence. I sat there, gasping, waiting for the tapping to start again. But it didn't. Instead, a voice, soft, almost gentle, whispered from just beyond the door. Almost free. I barely slept that night. I stayed curled up on the floor by the door, listening to the silence outside, waiting for the tapping or the soft, mocking voice to return. But it didn't. Morning came, sunlight streaming weakly through the blinds, and still I sat there, clutching the dead flashlight. It took everything I had to drag myself to my feet and go about my day. I showered, dressed, made coffee I couldn't stomach, all while my mind raced, replaying that moment over and over. The figure's face, the voice, the boundary. My thoughts twisted into knots of dread and confusion, and I knew I wouldn't be able to rest until I understood what was happening. The journal was my only clue. I retrieved it from where I dropped it in the backyard, half expecting it to be gone or worse, changed. But it was still there, pages slightly damp from the dew, lying innocently on the grass. I grabbed it and went back inside, locking the door behind me with trembling hands. I spent the entire morning poring over its contents. Most of the entries were fragmented, disjointed, a maddening blend of half-formed thoughts and cryptic warnings. The author, whoever they had been, was clearly terrified, unraveling bit by bit as the entries progressed. But buried among the ramblings, I found snippets of information, tiny fragments of insight that began to form a clearer picture. The first thing I learned was that the lot hadn't always been empty. Years ago, there had been a house there, a small, dilapidated building that had stood on that spot for decades. The journal's author described it as a blight, a place that seemed to repel people and light alike. Neighbors avoided it, children whispered rumors about it, and over time, it fell into disrepair. It would have been forgotten entirely if not for a series of strange incidents that began around the turn of the century. The entries spoke of missing pets, strange lights at night, shadows moving behind drawn curtains. People started reporting voices, a soft, insistent murmuring that seemed to come from nowhere, growing louder the closer you got to the house. The landlord, back when he was still a young man, had lived in the building even then, and according to the journal, he had tried to investigate. But every time he got close, something would drive him back. Whispers in the dark, a sense of being watched. Then one night it all stopped. The house was gone. There was no record of its demolition, no explanation for its sudden disappearance. One day it simply wasn't there. In its place was the empty lot, a patch of bare earth surrounded by a freshly erected chain-link fence. The neighbors assumed it had been torn down quietly, some sort of emergency condemnation. No one thought to question it, but the author of the journal did. They described watching the lot night after night, seeing shadows flit through the darkness, hearing that soft, rhythmic tapping. They began to suspect that whatever had been inside the house hadn't been destroyed, just trapped, contained within the boundaries of the lot, held in place by something else. Something that required constant upkeep, reinforcement. That was where the symbols came in. The author referred to them as wards, sigils meant to anchor the boundary and keep whatever was inside from slipping free. But they were weakening. The author didn't know why, just that the lot was changing, the boundary thinning, the symbols losing their power. And as the boundary failed, the tapping started. I shivered, running a hand through my hair. There was one entry, buried halfway through the journal, that sent a chill down my spine. April 8th. They're at the edge now. I see them every night, standing just outside the circle. They tap and the symbols fade. I tried reinforcing them, but it only buys me time. I don't know how much longer I can hold them back. The author had been trying to maintain the boundary. They had known what was happening, had tried to stop it, but they'd failed. I flipped through the remaining entries, my breath quickening. There had to be something in here, some way to restore the boundary, to keep whatever was inside from breaking free completely. And then I found it. The last few pages were covered in drawings, rough, frantic sketches of the lot and its symbols, surrounded by notes in increasingly desperate handwriting. The author had drawn each ward, detailing its shape and placement, along with notes on how to rebind the boundary. But the final page, the one scrawled in thick, jagged lines, caught my attention. The key is the center. Reinforce the central ward. If the core holds, the rest will follow. The center. I glanced back at the earlier sketches, noting the layout of the symbols. The author had marked a single point at the very middle of the circle, the spot where I'd seen the man standing, tapping his rod against the ground. That was the core ward, the anchor that held the rest of the boundary in place. If I could reinforce that one symbol, maybe I could strengthen the entire circle, buy myself some time. But how? The author's notes were frustratingly vague. They talked about specific shapes and patterns, but there were no clear instructions, no guide on how to carve or draw the symbols. And what if I got it wrong? What if I made things worse? I leaned back, rubbing my eyes. I was in way over my head. This wasn't my problem. I should just leave, pack up my things and get out of this place before. A soft knock on the door. I froze, pulse hammering in my throat. Another knock, louder this time, echoing through the quiet apartment. Who is it? My voice came out strained, barely more than a whisper. Silence. I waited, heart pounding, staring at the door. Slowly, cautiously, I crept forward and peered through the peephole. No one was there. I took a deep breath, hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. I hesitated, then slowly, carefully, unlocked the door and pulled it open a crack. The hallway was empty, but there, lying on the floor just outside my door, was a small, neatly folded piece of paper. I stared at it for a long moment, then leaned down and picked it up. The paper was cold to the touch, almost damp. I unfolded it slowly, hands shaking as I read the single line written in dark, jagged letters. It knows what you're doing. A chill ran through me. I crumpled the paper, heart racing, and looked around wildly. The hallway was still empty. I slammed the door shut and backed away, pulse hammering in my ears. It knew. Whatever was in that lot, it was aware of me, and it didn't want me to reinforce the boundary. But that only meant one thing. I was on the right track. I turned back to the journal, resolve hardening. I didn't know what was in that lot, or how it had ended up there. But I knew one thing. I couldn't let it break free. If the central ward was the key, then I needed to find a way to restore it. I needed to finish what the author had started. Because if I didn't, I had a feeling that soft, mocking voice wouldn't just be whispering from outside the door next time. I spent the rest of the day preparing. If I was going to fix the central ward, I needed to know exactly what I was doing. I studied the journal until the symbols were burned into my brain, tracing their shapes over and over until I could draw them with my eyes closed. They were strange, angular patterns that seemed to twist in on themselves, lines looping in ways that made my head ache if I stared at them too long. By dusk, I was ready. I packed a small bag with the supplies I thought I'd need: chalk, a flashlight, a knife. I even grabbed a canister of salt from the kitchen, though I wasn't entirely sure why. Something about the journal's emphasis on boundaries and containment made me think it might come in handy. Maybe it was just superstition, but I wasn't about to take any chances. As night fell, I watched the lot from my window, waiting for the tapping to start. It always began around the same time, and tonight was no different. The first thunk echoed through the stillness, sending a shiver down my spine. I took a deep breath, grabbed my bag, and headed downstairs. The backyard felt different tonight. The air was thick and heavy, pressing against my skin like a living thing. I approached the fence slowly, peering out at the lot. There, at the center, stood the figure with the rod. His back was to me, but I could see the rhythmic motion of his arm as he tapped the ground 3 times, then a pause. 3 more, then silence. My pulse thundered in my ears. The lot was darker than I remembered, the shadows deeper, the grass strangely still. And then I saw it, at the far edges of the circle, just beyond the reach of the streetlights. Other figures were gathering. They were hard to make out, shifting in and out of the darkness, their forms blurry and indistinct. But there were at least a dozen of them, all standing just outside the boundary, watching, waiting. I swallowed hard and forced myself to focus on the center. The man was still there, tapping steadily. If I could just get to the middle, if I could restore the core ward, maybe, just maybe, I could stop this. I climbed over the fence, landing softly on the other side. The figures at the edge didn't move, didn't even seem to notice me. The man at the center kept tapping, his back still turned. I gripped the bag tighter and started forward, heart hammering. The ground felt strange beneath my feet, too soft, almost spongy. Each step sent a ripple through the earth, like I was walking on something alive. I forced myself to keep going, eyes fixed on the man. 10 steps, 15. I was almost there. He stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. The man stood perfectly still, the rod hanging limply at his side. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then he turned. I froze, breath catching in my throat. His face was pale and gaunt, skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. But it was his eyes that stopped me, cold, black, empty voids that seemed to swallow the light, pulling everything around them into darkness. He smiled, lips peeling back to reveal teeth that were too long, too sharp. Almost free, he whispered. Before I could react, he drove the rod into the ground. A shockwave rippled out from the point of impact, and the boundary around the circle flared, the symbols on the ground flickering and twisting. The figures at the edge began to move, shifting closer, their outlines growing clearer. I had to move. Now, I dropped to my knees, fumbling with the chalk. The central ward, the symbol I needed to restore, was right in front of me, half erased and smeared with dirt. I sketched frantically, my hands shaking, trying to remember every line, every curve. The man watched me, that awful smile never wavering. "You're too late," he murmured. "It's already begun." The symbols around the circle pulsed, the bare dirt at the center trembling. I gritted my teeth, pouring everything I had into the shape. It had to be perfect, one mistake and the whole thing would collapse. "You think you can stop us?" The man's voice was soft, almost amused. He stepped closer, the rod still embedded in the ground. "You're just another fool. Just like the one before." My heart skipped. The one before, the journal's author. The one who had tried to maintain the boundary. What happened to them? I demanded, still drawing. "What did you do?" The man chuckled. He thought he could hold us back. Thought he could keep us in our cage. "But you can't contain what doesn't want to be contained." He gestured to the figures at the edge. They were clearer now, pale, twisted shapes with hollow eyes and two wide grins. And in front of them, right at the edge of the circle, stood a single, hunched figure. My blood ran cold. It was the author, or what was left of them. Their face was a pale, skeletal mask, lips drawn back in a rictus grin. They stood there, swaying slightly, hands clutching at the dirt like they were trying to hold themselves up. The man's smile widened. "We broke him," he said softly. "And now we'll break you." The ground shuddered, the symbols flaring bright red. I gasped, fingers slipping on the chalk. The central ward was almost complete, just a few more lines. The man lunged. I didn't think. I grabbed the canister of salt from my bag and flung it at him. He shrieked, the sound inhuman, and staggered back. The salt scattered across the ground, and the moment it hit the symbols, the entire circle blazed with light. "No!" he roared, clawing at his face as the salt sizzled and smoked. I took my chance, slashing the final line into the dirt. The symbol flared, and the world seemed to fold around me. The ground trembled violently, the figures at the edge convulsing and writhing. The man's scream tore through the air, a high, keening wail that made my ears bleed. And then, suddenly, it was over. The lot went still. The man was gone. The figures were gone. Even the journal's author had vanished, leaving only a thin, acrid smell in the air. I collapsed, gasping for breath. The boundary was intact. The central ward held. It was over, or at least I thought it was. But as I looked down at the restored symbol, a chill ran through me. The journal's final warning echoed in my mind. Asterisk, the key is the center. Reinforce the central ward. If the core holds, the rest will follow. Asterisk. The core did hold. But the others, the symbols at the edge of the circle, they were gone. I staggered to my feet, heart pounding. The salt had scattered most of them, and the few that remained were faint, barely visible in the dim light. The boundary was still there, but it was fragile, crumbling. I had only bought myself a little time. A soft breeze rustled through the lot, carrying with it a faint, familiar sound. Asterisk, tap, 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 asterisk. I turned slowly, dread coiling tight in my chest. There, just beyond the fence, a single figure stood, hunched and swaying. It lifted a hand, pointing at the ground. The tapping resumed. The boundary was breaking again. And this time I knew no amount of salt or chalk would be enough to stop it.